Welcome, everyone. We are glad to have you here for our Cultivating Curiosity webinar with Center for Inspired Teaching. My name is Jenna Fornell. To get started tonight with an answer to this question, what do you find most challenging about helping your students build relationships with one another?
I'll go. When I taught, my most recent teaching role was in a middle school, and oftentimes middle schoolers are at this age where either they've been with the same group of kids for quite some time and developed relationships with them that are quite connected, and they have trouble with letting new people enter those relationships, or they're all in a new kind of space where they all just feel kind of awkward and don't really know how to establish relationships with each other or have conversations with each other because they're kind of like an outsider coming in. So um, I think that technology does have a lot to do with the ability for kids to be able to connect on some level because they communicate in different ways with technology. But ultimately, I think that allowing new people in is probably the hardest relationship dynamic to navigate as a teacher.
Let's see in the chat, it says, I teach pre-K and usually these kids are great in making friends, save for a few exceptions, like with kids who have language issues, right? So language, particularly if there are that, and that I'm taking in that last sentence, that could mean all kinds of things. You're going to hear in a moment from a teacher in the inspired teaching community who actually talked about the fact that the language of relationship building, the language of learning how to compromise, share your opinion, listen to other people, reflect back what you hear. That actually during COVID, a lot of students didn't have exposure to that because they were in environments where they were getting, they'd ask for something and they'd get it right away without negotiation. So actually, a lot of teachers of young, I've heard this from other teachers of young students that there's actually a whole vocabulary around relationship building that students need practice with in the classroom.
I was just going to add that as a high school teacher, I think a lot of my students feel a certain shyness in real world classroom, especially as young folk who lived, through COVID times. And so I find sometimes just doing something very, very old school, like if we're, sometimes just having a game day, board games, and just having it be, just like your sibling with your siblings or your neighbors, just have, just have it be kind of apart from academics and just where you almost forget about yourself because you're having fun. And I think that's important because I find, yeah, a lot of students just one, don't want attention drawn right to them, and two, don't quite trust that everyone has their well-being front and center, and that's something I talk to kids about. It's maybe they do, but but we don't trust it yet, and what can we do to build that? So that's something.
Oh, thank you. There's so many beautiful things in what you're saying right there. That trust thing, just hearing you describe that takes me back to thinking about myself in high school. That's such a big thing. I mean, it's scary. It's scary to put yourself out there, but also if you don't, then how are your peers going to learn who you are? Well, keep those things in mind. And at any point tonight, if another one occurs to you or something that you're struggling with, one of the beautiful things about these webinars is that while Center for Inspired Teaching has things and ideas that we want to share with you, also your colleagues who are joining you in these webinars have so many ideas to share. So this is a great place for us to be able to learn from one another. If you're brand new to Inspire Teaching, we are a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. that's been working with educators to work towards this goal of every child and teacher loving coming to school, having school be a place filled with joy, filled with these four eyes over here with intellect, inquiry, imagination, and integrity. We've been doing that since 1995. And we do this in lots of different ways. We do it through webinars like you're experiencing right now, and also through in-person workshops, through online publications. Hooray for Monday, if you haven't subscribed before, is something you can subscribe to get ideas and insights in your inbox every week. To jump right in, here are our goals for this evening. We're going to talk about the key skills essential for relationship building, talk about what those might be in your own experiences, and listening to an inspired teacher who we've worked with for many years talk about that from her perspective. And then we're going to share a variety of activities that build skills in these things like taking turns, giving and receiving feedback, using active listening, learning how to compromise and acknowledge different perspectives. And then many of you may be familiar with our ABCDE of learner needs, but talking about how this framework that we use to talk about motivation in the classroom applies in the context of building relationships as well. And so what I wanted to start us off with tonight, and unfortunately she couldn't join us in person, but I have a colleague named Kaneia Crumlin who has worked with inspired teaching for, I think at this point, almost 20 years in a variety of different capacities, but has also been in and out of lots of different classrooms over the years, teaching all kinds of different grade levels and different subject areas, and is currently a second grade teacher in DC. And we're going to open with listening to her talk about her experience with relationship building in her classroom and her school context. She'll also be talking a little bit about what this looks like in her life outside of school and her interaction with other adults, but also with her own children. And what I'll invite you to do as you listen to her talk is just notice like what stands out to you from the experiences she's sharing. What are you hearing that resonates with your own experience as an educator? What questions does it raise for you? What are some ideas that she shares that you're thinking those are things I might want to try, or maybe those are some things that I have tried but they haven't gone very well. Without further ado, we're going to start out and listen to Kaneia and just notice what you notice, and then we'll talk afterwards about what stands out to you from what she has to share.
I think in this day and age, empathy could go a really long way. And I think it's something that is being talked about more and more. I think particularly with the pandemic and like people just needing an extra dose of empathy and grace. I just think empathy is something that I hope that we never let go from our toolkit, and we sort of always make sure it's a necessity. Like you carry your wallet, you carry empathy, right? Like it's just not necessary. So empathy is a big thing, and that's something that, as a parent, I am so humbled. I think one thing about teaching this particular age group, I mean, I would say the same about middle schoolers, but particularly elementary school, because you think you're coming in with like all this background knowledge, all this, and you forget about the background knowledge that they're coming in with, right? And the perspective that they're bringing to the table, and how some ideas are really formed in their brain and then some ideas are not so much, right? But I'm humbled daily when I have to just personally like facilitate a conversation with my own child, and I'm not being very empathetic, and I'm just wanting the conversation to move so we can go out the door and move on with our lives. It's just so humbling when they're like, you're not taking your deep breaths and you're not being kind in the way you're speaking to me. And I'm just like, so it's humbling is probably the best way to describe. So empathy and humility, I guess, just humility and the ability, which I think works really well with empathy, the ability want to learn, to want to lean into someone else's perspective. So empathy, humility, and then self-advocacy. You think grownups have it, but a lot of times we don't. And we become petty labels, or we just, are not as forthright and as gracious in our speech with each other as we could be. And so that's a skill that I see in myself and adults still developing, and that I'm also trying to develop in my own children and my students, right? Like you have a voice, your voice matters. This world needs your voice. And that also means that if you have a need, like please articulate that need, right? And know that, the adults around you want to hear your need and want to help you honor that need and sort of solve that problem with you. Obviously in the first 6 weeks, first 2-3 months, honestly, I'm really intentional about the type of activities that we do, and allowing those threads of empathy and those conversations of humility, and really empathy and self-advocacy are the big pieces that I really push with my students. Because I want them to be kind, right? You have to have a level of empathy in order to be kind, and I want you to also to state your need and allow the community to sort of help you find a solution to that need, right? So I'm really intentional about those conversations, and whether it's community building activities, whether it's a lesson that we've done and something bubbles up between a student and another student, and we're like, this is a great, just being intentional and deliberate about finding those teaching moments within the classroom space and during the outdoor play space, because inevitably whatever happens outdoor play trickles back into the classroom, right? So we have a built-in time. It's not long. It's like a 10-minute, sort of built-in time to like after those outdoor plays to reset. Some box breathing. Reset can mean, eyes closed, playing some soft music while folks are just, again, breathing, stretching, anything that gets the brain and body ready to engage in learning again. And might help, it also could look like having sort of conversations, like facilitating conversations amongst peers about maybe what happened outdoor play and, reminders about how we, what we do, what can we do? What can our friends do in this instance? What should they do? What should they not do? Right? Like sort of peer coaching, if you will, like allowing their peers to sort of help them facilitate. So like for us, it's just about giving opportunities for our young people to reset and to self-reflect. We do that because those moments are necessary. They're necessary for not survival, but for thriving, right? They're necessary for learners of all ages. And I think it sets a message to them like, hey, we've had these things, we build these things into our schedule because they're important. And we talk about why we have a reset there. We talk about why there's independent reading time. We talk about why there's a calm corner, right? Like we talk about every single corner of our room and why there's a purpose, right? There's a purpose for everything. And so as long as we're intentional and we're purposeful about what it is, in addition to the curriculum, right? What it is that we want to teach them concurrently with that curriculum, I think that goes such a long way.
For someone who's listening to this and thinking, that all sounds great, but how would I know if I was being successful with that? Can you give an example of sort of what it looks like, sounds like, or feels like when you observe either your own children or the children that you're teaching
Yeah.
engaged in something where you're like, oh, they are putting these skills to work.
Out in the playground, it looks like I have less instances of students running up to me and saying, so and so did this to me, right? And more instances of students having an issue, talking it out, right? Realizing is that like a pebble, a rock, or a mountain of incident, and like sort of sorting that out amongst themselves, and then commencing to play again. And so when I see instances of students running up to me decrease, I realize like there's something happening here that's not requiring me anymore. This is a gradual release of independence that is my goal, right? When I read students' journal entries, read my own kids' journal entries, and when they're reflecting on their week or their day, and there are questions in there that prompt them to sort of engage with these ideas, right? These skills, and I hear their own little articulations of how they're internalized or processed a moment. It really is another way to let me know like something's getting in, it's sticking. When I overhear conversations with students or my own children, and they're like, we should use our voice, and I've used my voice, and I would like to, you're just like, yes, this is happening. So sometimes it's cliche, but they're seeds, right? And sometimes when we plant seeds, sometimes you're around to see the harvest, right? And that's the gift of teaching. Sometimes you're not, right? And so I think we as educators need to focus more on the long game, right? Like, what are we wanting to harvest here? And having a realistic expectation of how long it takes to see the harvest. There are, I guess, explicit or implicit ways that I sort of receive data from them, letting me know that yes, it's clicking, it's sticking, we are on the right track. And sometimes I'll have like a weekend investigation where I'll say, okay, your weekend challenge. And a lot of them at this age want a challenge. They're like, I know 2 times 2, I want a challenge. So I'm like, great. Your weekend challenge is to see how many ways or all the opportunities that arise for you, like bubble up for you to be kind, or the opportunities that bubble up for you to be empathetic. And I'll say like bring 2. Maybe one moment where it was really easy for you to be empathetic, and one moment it was kind of hard, a little challenging, right? Because what we're going to do is we're going to reflect on that challenge. We're going to reflect on both of them, but that challenging one, like, is going to sort of give them some insight to like, ooh, why was that hard for me? Like, why was that a little difficult? Something I do with my students a lot is, what I noticed about myself was X, right? If they're like, so and so, said this about me. Like when that person said that, what did you notice about yourself? Like, oh, I mean, that's hard in the beginning, right? You sort of have to sort of walk them through that. But by like mid-year, they're like, I noticed that I started to cry, or I noticed that like my brow started shooting downward because I was mad. Like they start to notice how the emotion sort of shows up in their body, right? And I think that's that level of self awareness. Like when we can teach children how their body is responding to these sort of environmental stimulants,
Mhm.
i.e., their peers, then I think that begins the work of just emotional awareness, self awareness, and that sort of thing. There is a colleague of mine, and on her email signature, it says smile and breathe, breathe and smile. I forget which direction it's in. And I love that reminder. And I want to offer it to all your listening audience just to breathe and smile. And one thing I would add is pace yourselves. Pace yourself. Smile, breathe, pace yourself. Maybe breathe again. Because I mean, you just need that, and that gives you a moment to reset when something crazy has just popped off, or, you know, something unexpected, an opportunity, outstanding opportunity to grow has just presented itself. Smile, breathe, smile, and pace yourself. That's it.
So just listening to all those different ideas that she shared, what resonated, what does that bring up for you in terms of things that you're doing with your students? I'd love to just hear a little bit from your impressions there, and then we'll launch into looking at some concrete and specific ways that some of those things she describes can happen, can be made real in your classrooms.
I can start. For me, I definitely know. Oh, well, first off, let me say hi, everybody. My name is Isaiah Thomas. Um, I am a fourth grade lead teacher at Mundo Verde, and I actually notice a lot of what she was saying within my own classroom. Sometimes I have students that come to me, more so complaining about something that another student did, or not sharing or anything like that. So usually what I have to do is step in myself in order to help people, or help my students rather, just be mindful of how they're speaking to each other, because a lot of times they will instantly jump to taking the route of not necessarily saying anything mean, but saying it in a mean way where it may hurt somebody else's feelings. And I have to, 9 times out of 10, come in and step in and say, it's not always what you say, but how you say it. And then I think that those, a lot of those times it kind of sticks with the kids because I continuously repeat it. And then they always continuously, like, afterwards, lessen their impact when it comes to how they deliver their words, and start to kind of pause after they know that I'm actually hearing and listening to what they're saying. So that way they are more of neighbors rather than just another annoying person who is trying to tell me what to do in the classroom or anything of that nature. I want them to actually make look at each other as though they are a community rather than just two people who are just so happen to be in a classroom together.
Mm. I love that, and I love also that that part of what you're building in your students, and this is something that really struck me from Kaneia's words too, is that really important component of reflection that's in there. That it was just it's interesting listening to what you're saying and what she's saying, that as much as we think relationship skills and relationship building is about us in relation to other people, a big part of it is about us understanding who we are, us in relation to ourselves. How do we start paying attention to the words that are coming out of our mouths? And it sounds like what you're modeling for your students is like is sort of that important pause to be able to think about my words, hear the words that I said, and think about how they might land with someone else. Do you see them do that for each other too?
Not so much for each other when I kind of, or when they are in their own agreements, they or disagreements rather, they more so point to how somebody else says something, and not necessarily think about they how they could help each other say something or make a delivery more, I guess, softer in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of, I know it's a learning process, and I know it's only like the second, third
Yeah.
week of school. So I don't expect it to like stick immediately, but over time I can, even now I'm starting to see like there are students that are kind of making sure that what they are saying is being delivered in the way that they intend rather than just being delivered just to either hurt or inspire. Even if they are frustrated or even if they are annoyed by a lot of their other peers, if they want something to be done, they are slowly realizing that the way that they are delivering something has to kind of change.
Oh, what a valuable lesson.
I've had similar experiences with my own children in when we have experiences with other children. My son um, is very quick to point out a way that somebody speaks to him, and he's very clear about how he wants to be spoken to because he's very particular about that. And I have to remind myself that all of the other kids around, and I have this conversation with him as well, but they are not having the same home experience that we are. And so I'm having these conversations with my son about how to speak to people and how, the way that you approach a person or the tone that you take with a person can be a sign of disrespect and so on. And I'm teaching him these things, whereas other kids might not be learning that. And so, really, it's so important that you are having those conversations with the kids because you might be the one to bring it to their attention that is even a problem. They might not even be aware that it's hurtful that they come across that way or that they raise their voices or that they're impatient or whatever it may be. And it really does help them to build that skill of self reflection where they say, hold on a second. Mr. Thomas told me that when I speak to somebody this way, they might get their feelings hurt because it can seem like I'm being impatient or that I'm being annoyed with them. When in actuality, I was just annoyed because I was having a rough day. So I need to try that again. And so they're going to start self reflecting. And I do think that by the end of the year, you are going to notice kids redirecting and you know, putting themselves in situations where they don't need your input. They're doing it on their own. So that's all about building those relationship skills.
All right. So, related to all the kinds of things that Kaneia was talking about and everything we've talked about here, if we kind of boil down relationship building, relationship skills into concrete elements, part of this is things like practicing taking turns and sharing with others. That's one of the first things we learn about how to be in relationship with other people. But what are some things that you do in your class that are teaching students this very like basic level of how we learn how to work in relation to one another?
One thing that I do, I call it like the accountability piece. So I'm a word language teacher. So my students are practicing their communicative skills really often. So I pair them and I pair them in silly ways, like find someone that has the hand like yours, the same size of yours, or find someone that has the same shoe size, or things like that. But then after they have the conversation, during the accountability piece, they have to share not what they were talking about, but what their partner was talking about. So, I mean, for me, it's also selfish because I want them to practice third person, but it's also like it's active listening exercise because they know what's coming next. We've done it so often that they know, like, oh, she might call on me, so I have to pay attention to what my friend is saying. And generally, the topics are quite interesting, music or social medias, or today, what were we talking about? We were talking about favorite drinks. So they were very happy to share. And they another thing, and I'm sorry, maybe I'm sharing too much.
No, no, not at all.
Another thing that I do is a spectrum, which is like we move from one side of the class to the other. Like if you like, uh, if you like what was that? Dr. Pepper. There was a big debate about Dr. Pepper today. Like, if you like Dr. Pepper, go to this side of the room. If you don't like it, go to that side. And they have to talk about why they like it, why they don't like it. So being a language class, there is some natural uh, listening. You have to talk, you have to listen, you have to think about yourself. But um there is a process to it. Like they have to get used to listening to each other, because they're speaking also in another language. So
Yeah, I love that. And I also love how you've got built in there that they're changing from first person to third person. I love that as a as a side effect of the learning experience. That's
I think
I
it's
want
also
to
important because sometimes when we get to middle school, we get this idea in our heads that things are elementary and too childish for middle schoolers, and we kind of forget that they're still children. And so sharing and taking turns is still happening in the middle school classroom. The only thing is, it looks different in the fact that their sharing and taking turns has to do more with discourse and working together. And so the way that you're doing that is emphasizing such a respect for each other in the classroom, that they're able to trust that, number one, I'm taking a risk by saying this in a different language that I might get incorrectly, but I'm taking a risk because I know that I'm in a safe environment. But also, I know that I'm going to have my turn. And so there's likely not a lot of interrupting, and not a lot of, like, you've established this space where they can practice this empathy and consideration for other people, even in something such as simple as, do you like Dr. Pepper or you don't like Dr. Pepper? So I think that's awesome.
yeah, I
thank
love
you.
it. I
Thank
love
you.
it.
And I would also like to say that I agree with you about the playfulness of the middle schooler. I mean, that's why I love teaching in middle school, although I had off to all elementary school. But I think, as an adult who loves the inspired teaching workshops, I love playing. I mean, I think play is for every age, no matter what. So I'm like, if I throw myself on the floor with them, they will follow me.
I love the examples that Kiara shared with us, but here are a couple of other things. And right here, you see games, which Jenny had brought up earlier. Those are so great to include in the classroom. There's so many different kinds of games too, and I don't think you're ever wasting class time if there's an opportunity for students to try card games, board games. Improvisation games, those kinds of things where they are playing and they are learning at the same time. In Up at the upper left hand corner, this one is increasingly becoming more and more of a challenge, but a graffiti board is a form of conversation where students are writing responses to one another instead of saying them verbally. This can be helpful. I love using this as a medium for conversation and discourse, especially for students who may struggle to speak up in class, and particularly at the beginning of the school year, if they're not that comfortable sharing their voice. If you lay out big sheets of paper with prompts and questions on them, and their task is to respond to the prompt, but then also to go and respond to, and it helps to give them a number, 5 other comments that you see on the paper. This is a way for them to talk and to share their perspective and to engage in a sort of conversation with someone if they're not yet comfortable doing that verbally in the class. And it also can be a really great record for you as a teacher of what the conversations are, where students thinking happens to be on a topic. I know sometimes people get nervous about this. What if students write off topic, or they write something inappropriate? Like any of these activities, I think it's super important to discuss, expectations before you dive in. But that can be another interesting way for students to practice having a dialogue with one another. And of course, in a world where I am so amazed by how much students actually are engaging in written communication and back and forth with one another because of technology. If your students are old enough to be able to text with one another, they're doing work like this all the time, in a typed form, but having them do it in a handwriting form is also, I mean, it's an analog version of what they do when they're texting, but can actually be really good for them too, because it's physical, and the act of writing, especially if you're doing it on a big sheet of paper, can often get them out of their desks and moving in different ways. And then over here on the right, I did not know that you were going to be joining us today, Isaiah, but actually this right here is Isaiah right here from this summer. One of the activities that we do during the Institute is called Word at a Time Stories, which is a great back and forth activity where someone says one word to begin a story, and then the next person comes up with the next word, and you go back and forth, constructing a story one word at a time. You can create one word at a time poems. You can create one word at a time responses to some kind of a prompt. But this is a really fun way to practice turn taking. And you can do all kinds of things with it. Use it as a way to start the idea of a story, and then have students take that story and write out what happens next. You can also do this in a whole group or in smaller groups, like word at a time with a group of 4 students at a table, or word at a time with a whole class all together. But another way for everybody to be able to contribute and to practice, the process of listening to one another, so that my word that comes after your word helps make the story make sense. So those are just a couple fun turn taking activities. All right, another skill right here. How can we practice giving and receiving meaningful feedback? Because when we think about relationship building, I'm thinking about the example that Isaiah gave, actually, of helping students to become reflective on how their words might be landing with someone. That's an example of getting meaningful feedback on your language. But we can model this with our students, with the way that we give feedback and receive feedback. And there's lots of different ways to do this in the classroom. This is from an activity that an illustrator that I love named Carson Ellis was actually doing during the pandemic, where every Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday, she would put 3 prompts up onto her Instagram page. And then, given those 3 prompts, the task was for people to use those to end up creating an image based on what they had seen. Or what they had seen of those prompts. And then they would share whatever image came to mind based on these 3 phrases that were up there, using a hashtag. She called them Transmundane Tuesdays. And so people would use that hashtag and then share their images on Instagram. And one thing I'll be sharing with you tonight is a link to a document that you can cut up that has these different prompts in it. So you mix and match them. You can pull them out randomly or put them together in an intentional way, but it's a little bit of a random process to see what you come up with and then what you end up creating from it. So I'm going to challenge us, if you have a piece of paper next to you, we're going to do super, super fast. Play with this particular prompt right here and see what image comes to mind for you based on what you see. So this is an example of some of the other ones that people came up with. This was when Carson Ellis had put this up several years ago, this particular prompt. A lot of illustrators, children's book illustrators, get into doing this, but there's so many different variations that are up there. But with the activity that we just did and the drawings we had, doing something like this can be really fun with your students, and it's low stakes, and everybody's going to come up with something slightly different, right? Because we're all going to interpret those phrases a little bit differently. And having our students practice giving each other feedback in a way that is non-judgmental. So I think a lot of times Jenny talked in the beginning about students being afraid of trying to build relationships with one another because they don't know that other people necessarily have their best interest at heart or in mind. And so having students practice, particularly when we get into feedback, it's like, oh, a lot of young people are very good at sharing their opinions right off the bat. But teaching them about the idea that feedback, particularly feedback that's helpful to another person, doesn't have to be about someone's opinion. These are some examples of some questions that you might offer your students to practice with that aren't about judgment, that are about what I'm observing, that help me to engage into a conversation offering feedback, offering what I'm noticing, offering what it's making me wonder, and how it's making me make a connection. So just based on the images that you just saw just there, can anyone take a stab at offering some thoughts based on it can be a particular person's illustration or the illustrations in general, just seeing what it sounds like when we are guided by these questions and giving each other feedback. I'll start off.
Jennifer's
Oh yeah. Yes.
drawing made me think of like a character from some kind of like Greek mythology tale. And it was really impressive because it almost seemed like some sort of, like a sphinx or something, like one of those creatures where it's combined all together and it creates this like really strong, cool creature instead.
Well, I mean, something that I noticed it is about like my drawing and Irene's drawing are, for example, very similar. Because of the rounded head and the tail. So, um, but I didn't think about drawing it in a human form the way Jennifer did. So also, I'm very poor. I don't know how to draw human form so beautifully. So I didn't even try. Um, but it's just beautiful, like what you showed, that like basically this with the same prompt we can have so many different ideas. And I do something similar with my students when we learn body parts. I describe monsters or they have to describe monsters, and each one of them is so different just based on the words. And it's a lot of fun. Thank you.
And so in your class, when you do that, you give them a variety of words and then they're creating a monster out of those, but it's a vocabulary activity too.
Yes, I mean, basically, it's an interpretive activity because I say things like the monster has three heads, but I don't tell them the shape necessarily. And then, or I tell them, the monster has 10 feet, but I don't tell them what kind of feet. So some of them draw chicken feet, some of them draw regular feet. So it's a fun activity, and they all have to show it at the end.
Absolutely. And I think another really important part of building relationship skills that is going to happen in different ways developmentally. It's going to look different in Irene's pre-K classroom than it is going to in Jenny's high school classroom. But it's just increasingly over and over again becoming aware of the fact that we don't all think the same. We don't all see the world the same. We don't all have the same experiences. We don't all draw the same way. We don't all write the same way. Like we are not all the same. And within that difference and that variety, it's what makes things interesting, but understanding that is important in building relationships. So a playful activity like this, it is a really good illustration of that, because we can all recognize as a class that we started with the same three prompts, and yet what we created was vastly different. And so that in and of itself creates an interesting space for conversation. All right, so moving on to another skill right here. How can we practice active listening and reflective language? Kiara gave us some lovely examples of where you listen to a peer and then you have to say back what you heard. Are there some other strategies that you use with listening and reflective language being the idea of I'm thinking about what you said and I'm either reflecting back or I'm reflecting what I'm thinking based on the prompt or the conversation that I'm part of? So one of my favorite ways to have students practice active listening, practice reflective language, is by doing visual thinking strategies. And the way that this works is giving students an interesting and evocative image to look at in the classroom and having them talk about what they see. You can do this multiple times in your class with all kinds of different images. And every time that you do it with your students, you will find out something new about them. They will find out something new about each other. And it is deceptively simple to facilitate because there are just three questions that you ask your students. What is going on in this picture? What did you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find? The students are going to see lots of different things, and we're not trying to be judgmental about what we see right here. We're merely stating what we observe. So let's try that a little bit with this image right here. The opening prompt when you have students discuss an image is simply what is going on in this picture, and inviting students to share what they see, what they notice, and then following up when students share something by saying, what did you see that makes you say that? And what more can you find? And so let's just see a little bit what that sounds like. If folks can call out, or I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, what you're noticing right here.
There's a bulletin board with Spanish words on it. The word casa.
It seems to be in a school.
And what do you see? So this would be when someone would share something like Meg just did. What do you see that makes you say that?
The word wall, and then the little boy on the left reading a book. Maggie says she sees multiple scenes with some students, and she sees the American flag in a classroom setting.
Oh, see, this is one of my favorite things about doing visual thinking strategies. When in your class students point these things out, you'll see things that you did not initially see when you first look at the image. And that's the more that students share, the more that they share what they're observing, the more comes to the fore in the image that you're looking. Ah, Jenny says the people here seem to be in love with life. What did you see that makes you say that? Yeah, color, smiles, pattern. So when you do a visual thinking strategies activity with your class, and again, I'll send a link so that you can find more information about how to do this. This is an activity that you can do. Imagine if you can do this with an image that you're using that might be a prompt for a lesson that you're doing. Maybe you use an image from some moment in history before you do a lesson about that history. Or maybe you use an image that might conjure up something from a book or a text that you're reading with your students before you dive into the text. It can be a really interesting opening for more instruction that you're doing later that's related. Or it can simply be a really powerful warm up to do at the opening of class, just to get students talking, just to get students listening and noticing what each of them is noticing and what they're looking at. And the challenge is choosing an image that has a variety of things for students to look at. Just in the example that we had right here, everybody saw something slightly different in what they're looking at. And what happens as students share what they're observing as they look at this image, the image becomes more complex, it becomes more interesting with each contribution that students bring to it. And it can again be another one of those things where I am learning that my peers are seeing things differently than I am. I'm practicing taking turns and sharing what I'm observing. I'm thinking about how to make my language more clear, or how to take something that I've noticed and explain how it appeared to me or why it appeared that way to me. So this is just I said it's like a deceptively simple activity, because every time that I do this with a group of students, I'm kind of blown away by what they end up noticing. All right, so this is a big question. How can we practice acknowledging different opinions, learning to compromise, teamwork, and collaborative problem solving? What does that look like in your particular context? When are you having, what do learning experiences look like in your classroom where students are working together, problem solving, or doing a project together, or thinking about a question together where they're collaborating with one another? Because we have so many different grade levels represented, I'd love to hear the different ways that might look in your learning environments.
I think the important thing to notice about the question is that it has the word practice in it, because practice is something that they have to do. Like Isaiah was saying earlier, when they come in, they're just learning. They're just learning
Mm,
from us. And they've had all of summer break away from school where they didn't have the routine and structure, and they weren't used to the dynamics of the classroom that they're currently in. And so it takes time and practice and modeling and showing the ways that this looks, so that they can then take it, adjust it, and use it for themselves to then be successful in doing all of these things.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So practice is key, and a lot of times we can make that happen through these, the kinds of fun challenges that you see where students are trying to build a bridge with popsicle sticks that'll be strong enough to hold up a book, or making some kind of construction. One that I see everywhere is with spaghetti noodles and marshmallows, and can you create a tower using these kinds of materials, or with what's the tallest tower you can make with just newspaper and tape. So those are kind of standalone challenges that are kind of team building, designed to be team building. But I think you can also design learning experiences in your class, and all of those get at that practice that you're talking about, Meg, where we're trying this. It's not high stakes. We're just practicing what it means to try to work together on towards a collaborative project. But when I think about the idea of practicing that collaborative problem solving, again, this kind of comes back to, if I have to learn how to collaborate with someone else, I also have to learn that they're going to think in different ways than I do. And how do I develop an appreciation for the fact that they might present me with different perspectives and opinions? So I want to share an example of a way that you might guide your students through becoming aware of that with their peers. And this sort of thought experiment ends in an activity, a group project that students could do in your class, that has a lot of variation based on the grade level that you're working with, and the topics you might want to address. So it's called What's Best. And we're starting with that provocative term of best, because I realize, like, that's actually a word that is at the heart of a lot of our challenges and conflicts with one another, is having different opinions about what is best. So we're going to start actually with that. Choose one of these that you would be willing to share your perspective on. The best way to, and I've got 4 different options right here. The best way to make whipped cream, the best way to improve your mood if you're feeling grouchy, the best way to tie your shoes, or the best way to listen to music. Anybody want to share with us the best way from your perspective to do one of these things?
I'll share the best way to make whipped cream.
All right, please.
Also, now I want to go eat some whipped cream.
I do too. Yep. I haven't even
It
heard your
looks
way
so
yet.
it looks so
Yes,
good.
it does.
So the best way to make whipped cream is actually by hand, because you can control how thick the cream becomes, but you have to remember that if you're using it for something sweet, because sometimes I add cream to savory, add a tablespoon of sugar, of granulated sugar, before you start whipping it.
Before you start whipping it.
Yes.
All right.
Then you
Okay.
start whipping.
So
You
you
can
put
also
it
whip it with a whipper. It's okay, but I prefer to do it by hand so that I can control how thick I want it. I wanted it to be.
got it. And if you don't, and if you did it with, because if you did it with a piece like electric equipment, you don't have as much control.
No, I mean, because it's so delicate at the very end, it can become too thick. But that's me being very
That is your that is your best. That's your best. All right, I love it. All right, I think this is Irene. The best way to listen to music is watching the musicians live. All right. So there, thank you for sharing that. That is the best way to listen to it. And is that, Irene, would you say that that's true for all kinds of music? Yes, for me, yes. All right. Anybody else have a thought on one of these that they'd share?
Well, can I share? I had an idea of the way that I thought was the best way to listen to music, but then when Irene said live, I was like, oh yeah, that is the best way to listen to music. So what I had in mind was not actually the best way.
Well, what was your initial thought?
Mine was like with headphones really loud and standing up so you can dance with it.
I love that. I love that. We'll keep that in mind. And I'm glad that we've got 2 different takes on that particular one. Um, So these, I chose prompts here that I thought, guessing who might be joining us, knowing that we're all adults in the room. These are ones I don't know necessarily that a second grader is going to have a strong feeling about whipped cream. But if you were doing this conversation with your students, you might pick topics right here for them to first respond to that would relate to the things that they have strong opinions about, strong feelings about in their lives. And then the next question is, how do you know what's best? So for anybody who shared right there, um, if you would be willing to continue your thought process right now and share with us how you know what's best and why might someone else have different ideas about what is best?
I think it, I know it's best because it's what feels right for me, but someone else could have a different idea because they're not me. So what's best for me may not work for everybody.
Right. I was thinking in the experience that you and Irene were talking about with music. Um, I was thinking about that what's best for you in terms of music might be very dependent upon what you how well you can hear. So it might be that in a concert, it's hard to hear with all the noise, the ambient noise that's around you. So actually listening with headphones on, standing up and dancing might be better just based on how your body receives music. And Maggie says right here, the best way to make whipped cream is to open the can from the store and spray it right in your mouth. I love that. It's my best because I never have the energy to make my own and I don't bake much. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is very real. I definitely, that is often my experience with whipped cream too. So, and that example, when Kiara was actually talking about the best, what makes that approach to making whipped cream best for her, she spoke to the examples of being able to control it, being able to control the consistency of the whipped cream. So in the context of how she's using it, that's what makes it best. But if I just want whipped cream, my my need and my moment and my purpose and timing also have a lot to do with what's best. And if I just want some whipped cream right now, getting it from the can is going to be be a more expedient way to do that. Exactly. But this simple thing, thinking about how do we know what is best, is something that I think we actually develop a strong feeling about early on in our lives. And Jenny said, I know what's best when it feels magical. Yes, but even in that, like when it feels magical, that's how I'm going to know what my notion of best is. And having students think about what that feels, having students be aware of the fact that we might all have different ideas of best leads us into then having them try to collaborate. So if we all have different ideas about what makes something the best, giving them a challenge like this where they're actually playing with that word best is a way for them to get to build familiarity with, or build understanding and have conversations about how their peers might have different opinions and different feelings about something. So this is an outline for an activity that you could adapt in different ways in your classroom. So work with a partner to plan the best way to make the last 10 minutes of class valuable for everyone in the room. And what we notice in here is that we've got two very personal, opinion laden terms, best and valuable. And then down at the bottom, I have what I call creative constraints. And you could call this just the rules or expectations, but your plan must include both of your ideas, so you and your partner, follow classroom expectations. So it can't be something like, lighting fireworks in the classroom. It's got to be something that follows what your room expectations are. Take place in our classroom and not cost money. You could come up with whatever your creative constraints are, but I was trying to think of my inner seventh grader being like, oh, we're gonna, have a water park inside the classroom. You got to put some constraints on that thinking. But think about what would happen if you gave your students a challenge along these lines, in which they would have to negotiate and think about the terminology, and think about how they each are going to have different opinions about how they should go about that. And in the process of thinking through a problem like this, what they're really thinking about is, if your idea of best is different from a partner's idea of best, what will you have to do to come to one solution? So this is a way, kind of a backdoor way to get students to be thinking about compromise, to be thinking about how to share their perspectives, and learn from one another and think about how they can achieve a solution, even if they have very different notions of this idea of best. If you tried something like this with your class, you might actually then test out some of the solutions that students come with, maybe once a week, and end class in those 10 minutes with one of the ideas that a pair of students had come up with, which is another great way for them to build relationships with one another, feel some ownership over something that they created. Do any of you try things like this, having students play an active role in thinking about classroom, the design of the activities and things you do in your classroom?
The idea that I'm thinking of was not related to how the classroom functioned, but was just more of like a fun activity for them to do together.
Yeah.
And it was fall, which is perfect for right now. But we basically discussed different things that you can do during the fall, and a lot of them said going trick or treating and getting candy. And so they worked with a partner to come up with the best pail for getting like the most amount of candy for the best, like the most successful way to carry it.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to design it and come up with the ideas, but then they also had to test it out and then they had to present it to the class. So there was a lot of, backwards design and trying it out and trying again and, making changes.
Exactly. They're collaborating. They're trying to solve a problem together. But anytime you take a challenge like that and they are working with someone else on it, we're also working on those relationship skills, because there's going to have to be some compromise. There's going to have to be some finding a middle ground, in because everybody will come with a different idea about how to solve that. All right. So last but not least, to close us out here, we've thought about a variety of different activities that we can do that are getting students interacting, getting students listening to one another, taking turns. But one of the things that Kaneia was talking about in her remarks at the beginning, and that threads its way through all of this, is being aware of myself and my needs and my way of interacting with one another, the way my voice lands, when I'm sharing my perspective or even getting into an argument with my peers. And so we'll share more resources on this, but this is a tool that we use at Inspired Teaching called the ABCDE of learner needs. And these are the needs we all have in learners as learners that must be met in order for us to be motivated to learn. And in our classroom, all behavior is communication of one, it's communicating something to us. And when students are behaving in a way that doesn't support what you're trying to do in the learning environment, going back to these ABCDEs can be a good way to try to diagnose what's happening. If students are getting into conflicts with their peers, it may be that they're having an issue with belonging. If students are checking out during an assignment that you're having them do and it looks like they're just kind of overwhelmed, it may be that their need for competence isn't being met. If they're looking really lethargic and super bored, maybe it's time to up the engagement or think about how to bring some more fun into what's happening in the classroom. And we talk about this a lot with teachers as a tool for diagnosing what's happening in our classroom and for thinking about how to design our learning to meet these needs. But it can also be really good for students to have this as a tool for them to think about their own needs. And when they become more in tune with that, their own needs as learners, as people seeking to be motivated and engaged in the classroom environment, it also gives them a vocabulary in their relationships with one another. So being able to tell a student that, having students be able to have these as terms that they're able to use to describe why they might be struggling in something that they're doing in the classroom or in relation to one another can be really useful. I don't know if any of the folks who are on here who've used the ABCDEs before have any insights from ways that this has worked for them, but what I'm showing you on this particular page is something we'll share. There's a reflection sheet right here that you can use in your classroom, where students can actually be reflecting on how they feel like their needs are not being met, in a learning day. And then on the right, what you're seeing is a new tool that we've just created, that are called our ABCDE practice cards. And these are a set of cards that you can use. You can use them in lots of different ways, but one thing you can do is there's cards that have prompts on them to ask your students, for them to share with you their reflections on what they might need from their learning environment to be able to have these needs met. Has anybody had any experiences with ABCDE that they that are coming to mind that they want to share for those who might be learning about it for the first time?
I can share.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Um, I've actually used them in my class for crew. Um, what I did was kind of like how we did with the during the 3-day course where I had students have a card or they got a random card and then they also got up. They had about a couple seconds to find a partner that didn't have their color. And then they shared, well, they first shared the question, but then also shared the answers to the question and then switched the cards. And I found that a lot of students kind of took it serious. Well, to the extent which fun would allow. So they were able to think outside of the box and actually think about themselves and reflect on how they are as a student and how they feel they learn best or are interested in a lot of what they do in school themselves. And even for the cards that have to that more so talk about being a teacher, they either did one of two things, either acted as though they were the teacher and what they would want to see in a classroom, or put it in another self-reflecting form is, if my teacher did this, how would I feel as a student attending this class?
Students do know what feels good for them as learners, what feels like it, and they do know what makes them bored, and they do know what makes them interested. And asking them to share those insights with us can help us to meet their needs, can help other their peers in the classroom too. So I love that that's a way that you used it with your students. It was wonderful being able to learn with everybody. We love learning with teachers. It's what helps us all get better at what we do. And it's been a joy to be able to spend tonight with all of you.